All right, so the last thing here we're going to talk about before we call it a day is arguing and deciding cases. Well, what does that look like? And the Supreme Court is an interesting organization. It's really, really hard to get cases heard. My last slide, it was less than 100 cases a year get heard when there's 9,000 applicants. So like 1% of cases even get heard in the first place. We have a chart in our book here on page 421 that shows that we oftentimes we hear about only controversial Supreme Court cases, right? You'll hear like, oh my gosh, 5-4 split, five Republican Supreme Court nominees versus 4 Democratic Supreme Court nominees. That's happens, right? It happens, and it happens on the controversial cases. But most of the time, more than half the time, it's 9-0 like decisions. We don't hear about those. You don't even pay attention to them. The Supreme Court today just decided that there's no statutes of limitations on military rape cases. Okay, that's not going to make the news because it was a obvious decision. It wasn't a close call. Only the super close calls do we hear about. Do they make the news? Things like gay marriage, things like there was just a Supreme Court case that was a 5-4 split that came down and said you can't close down churches because the Constitution says that there's separation of church and state. So during the coronavirus, you can shut down businesses but not churches because that's in the Constitution, right? Those are the kind of cases that you're going to hear about, much more than the majority of these cases, which are 9-0 or 8-1. They're not that close, 7-2 splits. So in 2012, we're looking at, 78 cases, 23 5-4 decisions, and then that would make it 55 decisions that weren't that close. Actually, we have here that 38 of those decisions were 9-0, like just obvious answers. So then after and they're really short cases. I mean, you would think that with this process, it would take really long time. No, I mean, these are like days, one day they'll do the case. They'll hear it. You never get to actually watch it, but they draw pictures like you see here, and then there's audio, but you can never watch the Supreme Court, which is an interesting aspect of it. They make a vote, and then they don't come back with the answer usually until the end of the term, especially on big cases. But like if, for example, they do choose to hear one of the Trump cases, or the Trump case involving Texas suing to throw out the election results, then that would be something that they would do immediately. They'll be like, oh, we voted and there's enough people who want to hear this case. Case starts tomorrow. Like there's some that can be done now, right? And then there's some Supreme Court cases that take longer. In the election, they voted that state laws matter, right? So if the state said that you can have mail-in votes that are counted, that are postmarked by the election day, then that's what counts. The Supreme Court said that, right? But they said that federal law doesn't. So if the federal court stepped in and said, oh, well, you have to, count the ones that are postmarked because mail service was slowed down because, whatever, you don't have to count those because states do run their elections, right? But these are examples of Supreme Court cases that were solved on the spot, right? An issue came up, they met, they solved it, closed the door on it. Where these longer cases, you're questioning things like they recently ruled against unions, against which I'm a member of, right? And they ruled, and they said that public employees don't have to join the union, which is me. I'm a public employee. I'm a teacher, right? We have unions, and teachers used to have to join, and now they don't. But that was a case that took 6 months to decide. So the immediate action cases get decided immediately. The longer term things, where it's not an immediate thing. Gay marriage was another example like this. Supreme Court, Citizens United, campaign finance, these things, we won't hear about them till the last week. They'll start dropping some of the more controversial cases. But the quick ones, they do decide on the moment. Then one Supreme Court justice writes the reasoning why they supported it, and even the losing side gets to write its reasoning why. And sometimes we dig back into those reasons to try and use them in other legal matters. Setting precedent. There's a thing called precedent in the courts where if it happened once, we have to rule that way again. And oftentimes the court will cite precedents to use when it uses its decision. Interesting, though, they have no power to truly enforce their decisions. So, for example, in the 1800s, Andrew Jackson, president, guy on the 20, was told that he's not allowed to move the Cherokees out of their land in Georgia because they had followed all the rules put on them. There were 4 tribes there. 3 of them had not and had fought back, and then they were squashed by the American armies. They were killed, and their land was taken. But the Cherokees agreed every step of the way. And Andrew Jackson still forced them to move out of that land. But the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. And he says, what are you going to do to stop me? Even in the 1900s, Brown v. Board of Education, ending segregation in schools, there were a lot of governors who said, no, I'm going to keep segregating. What are you going to do about it? Including George Wallace, who famously ran third party in the 1950s and 60s, segregation forever guy, right? He literally stood in front of the door in a school and said, I absolutely refuse to allow desegregation. And they had to bring in the National Guard with their guns. When the military showed up, the local police backed down. And so did the governor, of course. So they don't really have, and that was only because the president ordered it. Dwight Eisenhower had to order the military down there. The Supreme Court can't order anything. So a lot of our government's kind of weird like that. There's a lot of wishy-washy, like, oh, well, the Supreme Court is law of the land. But you don't really have to listen to them. Electors for a state, they vote for the way the state chose to vote. But maybe there's a way around that rule. That was something Trump was trying to push in his most recent election. It's been such a historical period. If you're into politics, like what's happening in the last year or even a few months, I mean, it's just flabbergasting. It's absolutely amazing, the things that we're living through right now. But it looks like things are going to work out. All right. Anyways.